On the morning of January 5, 2004, a quiet district of Taichung City was just beginning to stir when something impossible happened. A young man plunged from the 9th-floor balcony of an apartment building and landed in the courtyard below. Within minutes, police reporters and stunned neighbors filled the street, unaware that the horror above them was only beginning. Because when investigators forced open the door of that same apartment, they stepped into a scene so brutal that even seasoned detectives froze where they stood. Good evening, and thank you for being here tonight, because the story I'm about to tell you is one of those cases that keeps investigators awake at night. Yao Yin was 18 years old, a university freshman who still blushed when strangers complimented her. Her friends described her as gentle and soft-spoken, the kind of girl who apologized when others bumped into her. She lived with her older sister Yao Shan-yun, who was 21, confident and fiercely protective. Their small apartment was a patchwork of sisterly contrasts. Yin's pastel notebooks beside Yun's bold sketch pads, a single houseplant they took turns forgetting to water. Yin's boyfriend Hung Guangyan was 23 and worked at his uncle's auto shop. He wasn't wealthy or well-educated, but he had an easy smile that once made Yin feel safe. Her family tolerated him for her sake, even when his temper flared. For Yin, love felt like proof she was grown. For Guang, it became proof of ownership. Taichung at that time was a comfortable place to live. Apartment balconies overlooked narrow streets lined with scooters and breakfast stalls, and neighbors still left fruit baskets outside one another's doors. Serious crime was rare enough that people remembered the last burglary as if it were folklore. The Yao sisters' building was modest but well kept, its tenants friendly, its hallways always bright. It was exactly the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. That Monday began like any other. Guang arrived at the apartment carrying a plastic bag of breakfast buns, pretending the argument from the night before hadn't happened. He greeted Yin, tried to joke, but she turned away. Her sister Shan Yun, never one to hide her feelings, told him to leave. Neighbors later recalled hearing a short burst of shouting, a door slam, and then silence. At 8 o'clock a.m., a dull thud shook the courtyard. When residents ran outside, they found Guang's body face down on the pavement. Moments later, police ascended to the 9th floor. Inside, they discovered 4 young people sprawled across a blood-soaked floor, Yin barely breathing, the others motionless. The room smelled of iron and burned oil, the metallic scent of violence that clings to everything it touches. It looked less like an apartment and more like a battlefield, condensed into 10 square meters. Detective Lu Wei, the first officer through the door, stopped mid-step. A kitchen knife lay near the entry, its handle slick. The victims' IDs were scattered on the table beside half-finished cups of tea. There were no signs of forced entry, no robbery, nothing missing, only rage. Paramedics rushed Yin to the hospital while forensic teams photographed every inch of the room. Even among veteran officers, few had witnessed something this savage inside an ordinary home. It was clear that the man on the pavement had been the killer, and that what he left behind would haunt the nation for years. If you're the kind of person who stays up late listening to stories like this, who finds something compelling about the mysteries that law enforcement can't quite solve, then I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that subscribe button and maybe drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now, because there's something about late nights that makes these stories hit differently, isn't there? Now, before we go any further, maybe lock your door if you haven't already, turn off the lights if you're feeling brave, and just listen. Because outside right now, the rain has started at first, just a few drops, tapping softly against the window, then building slowly into a steady rhythm. The kind of sound that makes the world feel smaller and the darkness feel closer. And in that darkness with that rain as our soundtrack, that I'm going to tell you exactly what happened to Yao Yin and her family. When investigators returned to the 9th floor apartment later that morning, the rain outside had stopped, leaving only the echo of sirens below. The living room looked as if time had frozen at the instant of violence. Blood trails marked each desperate movement. Detectives photographed every footprint, every overturned chair. From the balcony, they could see the tarp covering Guang's body far below. Inside, the silence pressed against their ears like weight. Detective Lu Wei called for forensic technician Chen Hao to begin the first full sweep. They measured the pattern of droplets on the floor, the distance between fallen knives, the angle of impact on the walls. Every calculation told the same story, rage carried through precision. On the kitchen counter lay a half-peeled tangerine and 2 porcelain mugs, one shattered by force. Near them, an unfinished letter written in a young woman's hand began with simple words. "Maybe we should take a break for a while." At Taichung General Hospital, Yao Yin fought for her life. Surgeons closed a deep wound on her neck and several slashes across her arms. She drifted between consciousness and delirium, murmuring her sister's name. When police questioned her hours later, she couldn't recall the attack itself, only the moment the door crashed open and her sister's voice screaming for her to run. The rest dissolved into noise. Detectives reconstructed Guang's final days through interviews. Co-workers at the auto shop described him as quiet but short-tempered. He'd recently shown up drunk, muttering about being pushed out of his own home. 2 days before the murders, he withdrew all his savings, just under 20,000 Taiwanese dollars, and bought 2 knives from a hardware store. The clerk remembered him because he asked for blades sharp enough to cut bone. When officers searched Guang's small dorm room behind the repair shop, they found notebooks filled with obsessive writing. One page repeated the same sentence over and over: "If she leaves, I disappear." Another contained rough sketches of the Yao sisters' apartment floor plan. It was clear this was no spontaneous crime of passion. It was the end point of weeks of spiraling resentment. Forensics produced their preliminary findings that evening. There was no forced entry confirming Guang had used his own key. Blood spatter analysis showed multiple attack sites, first in the living room, then the bedroom. The younger sister's defensive wounds suggested she had tried to shield her sibling. A single surviving fingerprint on the knife handle matched Guang's right thumb, proving conclusively that he had been both killer and victim of his own rage. News of the massacre spread through Taichung overnight. Reporters crowded the street outside the building, broadcasting live. The apartment's landlord stood pale and shaking beside police tape. He was polite when he paid rent, the man kept repeating. Always smiled. How can someone like that do this? Candlelight vigils appeared at the courtyard gate within hours, and strangers left white lilies for 4 people they had never met. Detective Lu reviewed every photograph before midnight. The image that stayed with him most wasn't the blood or the bodies. It was a tiny, stuffed rabbit on the sofa, spattered but still upright, its stitched eyes staring toward the open balcony. That single detail captured the unbearable collision between innocence and brutality better than any report ever could. By the 3rd day, the investigation had turned into a labyrinth of half-truths and dead ends. The media labeled it a romantic dispute, but Detective Lu knew better. Nothing about the crime scene spoke of romance. It was a calculated purge, a storm of anger that spared no one who stood in Guang's way. Police began re-interviewing everyone connected to the Yao family. The first name that surfaced was Derek Chen, a former co-worker of Guang's, who had been fired months earlier after an argument. A neighbor claimed she'd seen Derek near the building the week before the murders. Detectives tracked him down in Chiayi, where he produced time-stamped security footage, showing him fixing a customer's car at the exact hour of the attack. His alibi was airtight, yet the rumor persisted in the tabloids, painting him as the jealous rival. Next came Tom Wu, a neighbor one floor below. Reporters hounded him after an anonymous caller said he'd had a strange relationship with one of the sisters. Police questioned him for 7 hours, but nothing tied him to the case. Tom broke down crying, saying he'd only ever borrowed sugar from them once. The experience ruined his reputation. He moved out 2 weeks later, leaving behind a note taped to the mailbox. "Please stop asking me about ghosts I never saw." Every path kept looping back to Guang. The deeper detectives looked, the clearer his isolation became. His phone records showed dozens of unanswered calls to Yin during the final week. He texted her the same sentence again and again. "Why are you doing this to me?" followed by long strings of blank messages, as if silence itself were another plea. When investigators interviewed Guang's uncle, he described a young man torn between love and humiliation. He wanted her family to respect him, the uncle said, but he couldn't give them what they wanted. Education, money, manners, he had none of it. That shame ate at him. Back at the hospital, Yin slowly began to remember fragments. She told detectives that her boyfriend had shown up the night before the attack, drunk and crying, asking her to take him back. When she refused, he knelt on the floor and promised to change. Her sister had stepped in, saying firmly that it was over. Yin said Guang's face went blank, then like a curtain dropping, he whispered, "If I can't have you, nobody will." Those were the last words she heard before everything dissolved into screaming. Police psychologists reviewing the case called Guang's behavior a textbook pattern of escalating control. Over time, affection had turned into ownership, and when ownership slipped away, obsession took its place. Each humiliation being told to leave, returning his apartment key, seeing Yin's sister take charge, stripped him of identity until violence became the only language he could still speak. Detective Liu stood on the balcony that evening, staring down at the spot where Guang had fallen. The courtyard was quiet now, the pavement scrubbed clean, but he could still picture the crowd, the flashing cameras, the shock frozen on every face. He imagined Guang standing here hours earlier, heart racing, staring into the open air before stepping forward. In his pocket, the suicide note had read, "Sorry, Yin. Sorry, everyone. I couldn't control myself." It was brief, almost polite, but what chilled Liu most was the neatness of the handwriting. Even at the edge of madness, Guang had written each character carefully, as though the act itself were a final gesture of order in a world he had destroyed. That night, the detectives closed their case files for review. The evidence was complete, the story final. Yet for the surviving sister in her hospital bed, the investigation's end was only the beginning of a lifetime of unanswered questions, chief among them why love had to end in blood. Weeks passed after the Taichung murders. The public moved on to new headlines, and the apartment building reopened its 9th-floor unit to a different tenant who kept the curtains drawn. Officially, the case was closed, murder-suicide, clear evidence, no accomplice. But Detective Liu Wei couldn't stop rereading his notes. Something in the sequence of events felt wrong, a missing pulse in an otherwise complete body. In early March, a junior officer named Lin Tao began digitizing the evidence files. While tagging the photographs, he noticed that the numbering skipped from frame 72 to 74. Curious, he dug through the old analog folder and found a single undeveloped roll of film that had never been logged. When he developed it, one image stood out. It showed the bedroom from a lower angle than the rest. The camera pointed toward the baseboard near the closet. And there, faint but unmistakable, was a small rectangle of lighter paint, an outline of something that had once been there and had been hastily removed. Lou and Lynn visited the apartment that night. The new tenant was away, and the landlord, eager to cooperate, unlocked the door. The air inside still carried a faint metallic tang, the ghost of bleach beneath fresh paint. They measured the spot from the photo 72 centimeters wide, 30 high. Behind it the wall sounded hollow. Lynn fetched a screwdriver and pried along the seam. The panel gave way, revealing a hidden recess, lined with electrical conduit and dust. Inside, wrapped in a strip of cloth, lay a cheap flip phone coated in dried residue. At headquarters, forensic techs extracted the data. The SIM card contained 32 deleted messages sent over the weeks before the killings. Most were drafts unsent addressed to Yin. Each one read like a rehearsal of guilt. "I didn't mean to scare you, I only wanted to talk. They laughed at me again." But the final entry stopped, everyone cold. It wasn't a message at all, but a recording. The timestamp placed it less than 2 hours before the murders. When they played it, the audio began with Guang's breathing ragged and uneven. A woman's voice, Yin said, "Please leave." Then came a crash, screams, and the sound of something heavy striking the floor. The recording ended abruptly, followed by static. The file confirmed what investigators had already known, but added a human layer. No report could convey the fear in Yin's voice, the exhaustion in Guang's. The final descent of a man who believed love was a possession slipping through his experience. Hands. The recovered phone also revealed a call made 10 minutes before the attack, to an unregistered number traced later to a public payphone near the auto shop. Surveillance footage from that area showed Guang pacing, muttering, and holding the phone to his ear, speaking it seemed to no one. The call lasted exactly 47 seconds. When detectives dialed the number, it produced only a hollow tone, the line long since disconnected. No contact name, no record of a second participant. Just a fragment of a conversation that may never have existed. For Detective Liu, the discovery didn't change the conclusion, but it reframed the story. The murders were no longer a simple eruption of anger. They were a collapse premeditated in silence, rehearsed through unsent messages and phantom calls. Guang hadn't merely lost control. He had orchestrated the end, as though scripting a tragedy only he could perform. Standing outside the precinct after the report was filed, Liu looked up at the evening sky. The city hummed beneath dim streetlights, traffic drifting like distant surf. Somewhere beyond the skyline, another family was eating dinner, laughing, unaware of how fragile such ordinary peace could be. In his pocket, Liu kept the printed photo of the wall, the pale rectangle marking where the phone had slept unseen. It reminded him that even the most complete stories hide their secrets just beneath the surface, waiting for someone stubborn enough to look again. But what nobody knew until months later, when forensic specialists decrypted the damaged segments of Guang's old computer drive, was that the murders had not been spontaneous at all. In a folder labeled Dream Home, investigators found dozens of entries written like diary confessions. The earliest dated back 3 months before the killings. Guang had described in obsessive detail every grievance he believed Yin's family had inflicted on him. Her sister's sarcasm, her father's disapproval, even the neighbor's laughter when he rode his rusted scooter. Each entry ended with the same chilling phrase, "When the house is clean, peace will return." The final entry, written the night before the attack, read simply, "Tomorrow at dawn we will live together forever." Investigators also discovered photographs taken secretly from across the street, showing the Yao family through their windows, ordinary moments distorted into evidence of fixation. Guang had printed them on cheap paper, labeling each with times and notes. "She smiled today. She's thinking about me." The images formed a timeline of obsession, proving premeditation beyond doubt. When the trial opened in Taichung District Court, the gallery overflowed. Reporters filled every seat, sketching the lone survivor's profile as she took the stand. Yao Yin appeared pale and distant, her hair cropped short to cover the scars on her neck. She spoke softly, voice trembling as she recounted the morning her sister died. He wasn't angry, she said. He looked peaceful, like he'd already decided everything. Psychiatrists testified that Guang's writings reflected delusional control, a belief that love required destruction to remain pure. Prosecutors emphasized the meticulous planning, the purchased knives, the mapped apartment, the farewell recordings. The defense attempted to argue diminished capacity, portraying Guang as mentally ill and suicidal rather than homicidal. But the evidence contradicted them. His notebooks documented restraint, organization, and intent. Witness after witness detailed his transformation. Co-workers recalled a once polite man who stopped speaking altogether, who lingered outside the shop long after closing. A shop clerk remembered the precision with which he chose the knives. Even Guang's uncle, trembling on the stand, admitted he had seen the signs but dismissed them as heartbreak. He said he wanted to disappear, the uncle told the court. I thought he meant moving away, not. His voice broke before he could finish. Forensic expert Chen Hao presented the recovered phone messages and the final recording. The courtroom fell silent as the playback echoed through the speakers. Yin's pleading voiced the crash, then the abrupt static. Several jurors looked down, unable to meet her eyes. After deliberating for 3 hours, the panel returned with its finding. The deaths of the Yao family were intentional acts of murder, executed with clear premeditation, followed by the killer's suicide. The judge's final statement described Guang's actions as a tragedy born of entitlement, not madness. The verdict could not restore lives, but it gave the surviving sister something close to closure, recognition that she had not provoked the violence that took everything from her. When the session ended, Yin stood in the hallway, surrounded by cameras. She did not cry. She only said, I don't hate him anymore. I just wish I had left sooner. Those words echoed through the press for days, a quiet acknowledgement of the invisible chains that had bound her long before the knives ever did. Outside the courthouse, Detective Liu watched the crowd disperse. The case file would soon be archived, the evidence sealed in storage, the apartment eventually rented again. But in his notebook he wrote one final line. Sometimes love stories end long before the final act, they just need someone to notice. After the trial, the Yao family apartment remained vacant for nearly a year. The landlord said every new tenant complained of restless dreams and faint noises at night. Eventually, the unit was remodeled, its walls repainted, its floors replaced. But no renovation could erase what had happened there. To this day, neighbors still avoid the 9th floor, lowering their voices when they pass by the door that once opened into a massacre. Yao Yin eventually returned to her studies, though not in Taichung. She moved to Kaohsiung under a different surname, choosing anonymity over sympathy. Reports from classmates described her as polite but distant, always carrying a scarf, no matter the weather. She kept no social media, no photographs, and declined every interview. Only one message ever reached the press, a handwritten note sent to a memorial blog that read, I forgive him, but I will never understand him. Detective Liu was reassigned to another division a year later. He kept the case photo of the hidden wall in his desk drawer. Sometimes during long nights, he would take it out and stare at the pale outline where the phone had been concealed. It reminded him that the most horrifying part of any crime isn't the blood or the violence. It's the silence afterward, the way life goes on around the absence, as if nothing changed. The Taichung District Police now use the Yao case as part of their domestic violence prevention training. Each year, recruits listen to recordings of Yin's testimony and learn how obsession can masquerade as affection until it turns fatal. The small apartment building has since added brighter hallway lights and a new security system. Yet the people who live there say the true darkness never came from outside. It came from someone trusted enough to be let in. Yao Yin is now in her late 30s. She volunteers at a counseling center for women in crisis, guiding others through the kind of fear she once barely survived. Her story remains a quiet warning about the thin line between love and control. Her mother never recovered. She moved to the countryside where she keeps 2 framed photos on a table near the window, one of both daughters, and one of them as children laughing in matching dresses. Every year on the anniversary, she lights 3 candles and places a cup of tea beside them, whispering prayers for peace that never fully arrive. For the community, the memory has faded into something like folklore, the case of the boy who loved too much and the girl who lived to remember. But for those who still recall the details, it stands as a mirror reflecting something uncomfortable, how easily ordinary affection can turn to possessive rage, how fragile safety really is behind closed doors. Cases like this remind us that evil doesn't always appear as a stranger in the dark. Sometimes, it's someone familiar, smiling in family photos, helping to carry groceries upstairs. We teach our children to beware of outsiders, forgetting that the real danger might already have a key. The Yao tragedy teaches a painful truth. People can do terrible things, not because they hate, but because they can't let go of what they believe is love. And sometimes, that kind of love is the most dangerous of all. On the night of October 14, 1997, inside Seoul Detention Center, a convicted thief named Shin Chong-won vanished from a locked solitary cell that guards opened every 2 hours without fail. Surveillance cameras showed him asleep at 10:30, but by midnight, the bed was empty, the window bars untouched, and the cell door still bolted from the outside. He left behind his uniform folded neatly on the mattress, and a single line scratched into the concrete wall that read, "I just needed to feel the wind again." Shin Chong-won was 32 years old, a small man with quick hands, and the kind of nervous energy that never seemed to rest. Born in Busan to a dock worker, father, and a seamstress mother, he grew up watching cargo ships glide out of the harbor and disappear into fog. By 12, he was already stealing bicycles and selling them for spare parts. His teachers called him intelligent but uncontainable, a boy who couldn't stay still long enough to follow rules. By his 20s, he had become a legend among petty criminals for his uncanny ability to slip out of handcuffs, cells, and even moving police vans. Newspapers nicknamed him the Korean Houdini long before his biggest escape. He wasn't violent, but he was relentless. Arrested 17 times for burglary, fraud, and impersonation, he treated prison as a revolving door rather than a sentence. Each time he was caught, he smiled politely and said, "You'll see me again soon." Yet there was something almost childlike about him. He loved riddles, street magic, and puzzles that required patience more than strength. In interviews years later, guards described him as charming, even likable, a man who could make anyone laugh within minutes. He fixed broken radios for officers, helped translate English letters from inmates, and once repaired a leaking pipe with scraps of newspaper and toothpaste. Everyone underestimated him because he never seemed angry. He just looked like someone quietly waiting for an opportunity. Before his final incarceration, Shin had promised his mother he would reform. But when his parole was denied in 1997, something changed in his eyes. According to a fellow inmate, he began pacing his cell, whispering to himself about the open air, sketching diagrams on scraps of tissue. The man thought he was losing his mind. He wasn't. He was planning something no one believed possible, a disappearance from within a building designed never to let anyone leave. By early autumn, the guards had grown complacent. Shin's behavior appeared calm, routine, even helpful. He polished the metal fixtures of his cell, folded his blanket with military precision, and thanked the guards each night. Nothing about him suggested danger, nothing, that is, until he was gone. Seoul Detention Center in the late 90s was considered one of the most secure facilities in the country. The outer walls stood 6 meters high, topped with coiled wire sharp enough to slice through cloth. Guards rotated shifts every 2 hours, and each block had 2 surveillance points, one manned, one automated. Prisoners in solitary confinement were checked by flashlight through narrow slots in the doors. The system had worked without failure for decades. It was by every measure a fortress. Shin's cell sat in the oldest wing, built in the 70s and rarely renovated. The concrete was cracked, the paint blistered from years of humidity. The barred window, too narrow for a human shoulder, faced an inner courtyard lit by sodium lamps. No one had escaped from this wing, not once. Guards often joked that it would be easier to dig to China than to break out. That confidence, Detective Park later said, was their undoing. Inside, Shin maintained a routine that made him seem harmless. Each morning he folded his blanket into a perfect square, swept his floor with a rag tied to a stick, and bowed politely when the meal tray slid through the slot. He never caused trouble, never raised his voice. To the officers he was the ideal inmate, obedient, quiet, predictable. What they didn't realize was that every gesture, every word of gratitude was camouflage. During nightly rounds, a veteran guard named Choi noticed that Shin always sat cross-legged near the wall, facing the tiny window. He assumed the inmate was praying. In truth, Shin was studying. Between the rusted bars and the frame, a faint seam showed where the concrete had been patched years earlier. He would press his fingertips along it, counting seconds under his breath, memorizing vibrations as trucks rumbled by outside. It wasn't faith he practiced, it was measurement. In early October, construction began near the outer yard, adding noise that masked subtle sounds from the inside. It was all the cover he needed. Over the course of 2 weeks, Shin began scraping mortar from the seam, using the sharpened edge of a toothbrush handle, concealing the dust beneath his mattress stuffing. Every night, he replaced the loosened debris with toothpaste mixed with powdered rice to disguise the color. No one noticed. On the night of October 14th, the air inside the detention center hung heavy with heat. Guards made their final rounds at 10:30, logging Shin asleep on his mat. At midnight, Officer Choi returned for the next check. He lifted the viewing flap, shined his flashlight inside, and froze. The bed was empty. The door was still locked from the outside. He blinked, checked again. The folded uniform lay neatly on the mattress, as if Shin had undressed with deliberate calm before vanishing into the air. Choi unlocked the cell, his radio shaking in his hand. He expected a hidden corner, a crouched figure. Instead, he found a narrow hole behind the window bars, barely wide enough for a human chest. The bars themselves were still intact, but had been sawed from the inside, their bases reattached with an adhesive compound that broke cleanly once pressure was applied. The makeshift tools, wire fragments, a spoon handle, pieces of a disassembled pen lay scattered beneath the sill. The alarm sounded through the corridors. Floodlights snapped on across the yard. Every gate slammed shut, every guard called to stations. Search teams fanned out through the complex, but by the time the outer perimeter was checked, Shin Chong-won was already gone. No footprints, no discarded tools beyond what he left behind. Only a silence that felt heavier than noise, and an open window staring down at the courtyard like an unblinking eye. By dawn, the escape of Shin Chong-won had become national news. Television anchors spoke the words with disbelief. How could a man vanish from a locked cell without tools, accomplices, or outside help? The Seoul Metropolitan Police established a special task force by sunrise. Within 24 hours, every checkpoint, bus terminal, and harbor in the country carried his photograph. The warden stood before cameras, sweating beneath the flashlights, insisting there was no breach in protocol. No one believed him. Inside the detention center, investigators treated Shin's cell like a crime scene. Every inch was photographed, every wall scraped for residue. Forensic technicians recovered traces of powdered rice mixed with toothpaste where the mortar had been disguised. The ingenuity shocked even veteran officers. The compound had hardened enough to fool touch, but dissolved under steady heat. A formula Shin could have learned from maintenance workers or smuggled notes from another inmate. What baffled everyone was time. Between guard rotations, he'd had no more than 90 minutes. That was not enough for a clean escape, yet he'd done it. Detective Park, head of the task force, reviewed the footage again and again. The camera pointed directly at Shin's door, never once flickering or losing signal. The cell remained quiet until 10:30. Then, inexplicably at 11:41, the lens caught a faint reflection near the window, a momentary shimmer like light glancing off metal. The next second, the frame darkened. When the guard returned at midnight, Shin was gone. Park ordered technicians to test the footage for tampering. None was found. The mystery deepened. The first theory suggested an inside accomplice. 2 guards were questioned for negligence, both claiming ignorance. One insisted he'd heard faint tapping around 11, but assumed it was pipes expanding in the heat. The second admitted Shin had once fixed his radio and joked about escaping someday, but no one took it seriously. Their records showed no sign of bribery or communication. Still, suspicion lingered. The manhunt spread outward. Police scoured nearby neighborhoods, showing Shin's photo to vendors and taxi drivers. A farmer 40 kilometers south reported seeing a man in undershirt and slippers walking along the highway at dawn. Patrols followed the lead but found only footprints ending at a drainage canal. Another witness claimed to have seen someone resembling Shin boarding a cargo truck. Yet the driver later said the man was a hitchhiker heading north wearing work boots. The inconsistencies turned the search into a blur of false trails. 3 days later, a break seemed to come when a security guard at a rest area recognized the fugitive's eyes from the wanted poster. He described Shin eating noodles alone, smiling politely, and thanking the cashier before leaving. By the time police arrived, he was gone again. The CCTV footage confirmed it. The man had indeed been Shin Chong-won. He had cut his hair short, changed clothes, and walked calmly through the crowd, blending into ordinary life like a ghost disguised as routine. As the weeks dragged on, the escape turned into a public obsession. Newspapers ran diagrams of his cell, television hosts debated whether he'd had supernatural help, and talk shows turned him into a folk hero. Some called him a genius, others a symbol of defiance against a system they saw as corrupt. Every story seemed to make him less human and more myth. For the investigators still chasing him, the myth was the most dangerous part because it inspired others to dream about doing the impossible. Detective Park sat in his office surrounded by stacks of reports and coffee-stained maps. The sound of late-night traffic drifted through the open window. He rubbed his temples, staring at a single photograph. Shin's folded prison uniform, crisp and deliberate, lying on the thin mattress. To Park, it wasn't a symbol of genius, it was a message. A man doesn't fold his clothes before vanishing unless he expects to return. By the second month of the manhunt, every street vendor and night watchman in South Korea claimed to have seen Shin Chong-won. The tips poured in by the hundreds, each one slightly more improbable than the last. Someone swore he'd spotted him selling fish in Busan. Another insisted Shin was working as a janitor at a church in Daegu. One farmer near the border said he'd seen a man who smiled too politely, fixing a fence post in the morning fog. Every report ended the same way. Search teams arrived, checked, and left empty-handed. The public's fascination had turned the fugitive into a kind of national ghost story. Children traded rumors in schoolyards about a man who could walk through walls. Talk shows argued over whether he'd escaped using black market tools or secret government help. The myth grew faster than the evidence. For the investigators, that myth was poison. Every false sighting drained manpower and credibility, while the real Shin, if he was still alive, grew farther away with each wasted hour. Detective Park's team divided into two branches. One tracing material leads another, following psychological patterns. Park believed Shin would not run forever. His past escapes always led him back toward familiar places, his childhood neighborhoods, old haunts, even victims of his previous thefts. But the higher-ups demanded results, and soon the case became a political embarrassment. The Ministry of Justice labeled it an internal failure of supervision. Reporters hounded officers, leaving the precinct, asking how a man with no money or connections could vanish completely. The first serious suspect emerged when a black market mechanic named Kwon Do-seok was caught selling altered ID cards. Under questioning, he admitted forging documents for a quiet man with clever hands who paid in old coins. He even produced a sketch that resembled Shin, same sharp chin, same restless eyes. Investigators raided Kwon's workshop, but there was nothing connecting the fugitive. Fingerprint dusting revealed only Kwon's own prints. He later confessed he'd lied to avoid tax evasion charges. Another red herring. Next came Ji Min-ho, a taxi driver with a criminal record, whose neighbor claimed he'd been hiding someone thin and foreign-looking in his basement. Police swarmed his home, breaking locks and dragging Min-ho outside before realizing the man inside was his cousin visiting from Jeju Island. The media broadcast the humiliation live. By then, even the officers began doubting the purpose of their chase. "Every door we open," one detective muttered, "we just find another mirror." But one lead stood out. A retired prison guard named Han, who had transferred from Seoul detention years earlier, came forward. He told detectives that during Shin's first incarceration in 1992, the inmate had befriended a maintenance worker responsible for plumbing repairs, a man named Cho Guk-tae, now missing. Han recalled hearing rumors that Cho had taught inmates how to manipulate screws and fittings in exchange for cigarettes. Cho had been dismissed after being caught smuggling contraband, and no one had seen him since. Park ordered an inquiry into Cho's background. It turned out Cho once lived near Gwangmyeong Cave, an abandoned mine network turned tourist site outside Seoul. When Park visited the site, he stood in front of the dark entrance and felt a strange certainty. The tunnels stretched for kilometers, intersecting with old sewage channels that ran beneath parts of the city. It was the kind of place a man obsessed with freedom might dream about. The search team entered with flashlights and dogs, following damp corridors lined with moss and stone. They found nothing that night, just footprints that faded into mud and a faint smell of smoke that shouldn't have been there. Back at headquarters, Park pinned a photo of the tunnel on the evidence board beside Shin's last confirmed sighting. For the first time in weeks, the chaos of false leads began to narrow. The lines connecting pins on the board formed a crude shape that pointed in one direction, west toward the industrial outskirts of Incheon. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was enough for Park to feel the faint pull of momentum again. Somewhere out there, the man the public called a legend was still breathing, and for the first time since his escape, the distance between them began to shrink. 3 weeks after the dead-end tunnel search, a sanitation worker named Jang Ho made a call that changed everything. He reported finding a strange bundle wedged inside a storm drain near the Incheon freight terminal. When investigators arrived, they pulled out a waterproof bag containing a change of clothes, a broken flashlight, and a small notebook wrapped in plastic. Inside the notebook were hand-drawn maps of tunnel intersections, stretching from Gwangmyeong to the outskirts of the industrial port. The handwriting was unmistakable, slanted, compressed, every letter pressed too hard into the paper. It belonged to Shin Chong-won. The discovery reignited the case. Forensic analysis of the notebook found oil smudges consistent with machinery used in local shipping yards, suggesting Shin had survived long after the escape and might be working near the docks. Detective Park revisited the footage from nearby security cameras, dated around the time the bag was likely discarded. At 2:40 a.m., one grainy frame showed a figure walking along the canal in a cap and heavy jacket. The man's posture, the slight forward lean, matched Shin's profile almost perfectly. Park's team combed the area at dawn. They followed the storm drain deeper than before, tracing the water channels that ran beneath the freight terminal. Half a kilometer in, they found a narrow passage branching off from the main pipe, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. Inside were the remnants of a makeshift camp, a rusted kettle, empty cans, a roll of newspaper used for insulation. The air smelled of oil and metal. On the wall, scratched into the concrete, were 5 words, "Still here, just watching you." It was the message they'd been waiting for, but it raised a disturbing question. Was Shin mocking them or warning them? The investigation expanded to include port workers and ship manifests. One dockhand recalled a new employee who worked the night shift cleaning storage containers. The man had introduced himself as Jung, kept to himself, and disappeared a week earlier without collecting pay. His locker contained a towel, a half-eaten rice ball, and a torn photograph of the Busan harbor. Beneath the photo, written in faint pencil, were the words, "Home is where the sea breathes." By now, Park no longer doubted the pattern. Every escape Shin had ever made ended near the water, rivers, docks, piers. It was as though the ocean itself had become his accomplice. The task force alerted coastal authorities, placing checkpoints at major ferry terminals. But Shin stayed ahead, slipping through security lines by blending into the invisible labor force that kept the port alive. Men who lifted crates, scrubbed decks, and slept in containers that no one ever checked. When Park retraced the timeline, he realized something chilling. The night Shin disappeared from the detention center, construction records showed a plumbing crew working outside the south wall, installing drainage pipes connected to the same tunnel network found weeks later. Those pipes led through several kilometers of maintenance corridors to the very storm drain where the notebook was discovered. The path was indirect, but possible. It explained everything: how Shin had escaped without breaking the door or bars. He hadn't vanished into thin air, he had crawled beneath the prison itself. The revelation came too late. By the time investigators pieced it together, Shin Chong-won was already gone again. Ferry logs indicated a stowaway had been found aboard a cargo vessel bound for Japan. The man jumped overboard before capture and vanished into the dark water near international waters. No body was ever recovered. Some believed he drowned that night. Others claimed he made it to shore and started over with a new name. Detective Park closed the file years later with a single sentence typed at the end: "Confirmed escapee, presumed deceased status unresolved." But every now and then, anonymous letters arrived at the Seoul Metropolitan Police, addressed to Park. Each one contained only a single sheet of paper, always blank, except for a fingerprint in the corner, too smudged for identification, too deliberate to ignore. Park never told anyone, but in his private case log he added one more line beneath the official closure. "Still here, just watching you." But what nobody realized until years later, when an investigative journalist obtained declassified prison maintenance records, was this: Shin Chong-won hadn't planned his escape alone. The blueprints of the Seoul Detention Center revealed that one of the underground drainage systems had been extended in 1995 by a subcontractor registered under a false identity. That identity, Cho Guk-tae, the dismissed maintenance worker rumored to be Shin's mentor, had never been verified. The handwriting on the engineering notes matched the same compressed scrawl found in Shin's prison letters. Cho hadn't just helped him once, he had built the road beneath his feet. According to the journalist's report, Cho died in a factory fire 2 months before the escape. His body was identified through dental records, but one file in the coroner's report didn't match the fingerprints belonged to someone else. That small inconsistency reignited speculation that the fire had been a cover, that Cho and Shin had switched identities long before the breakout. The possibility turned the legend into something far stranger. Perhaps the man who vanished that night wasn't escaping to freedom, but returning to the life he'd already stolen. Officially, the government never reopened the case. By 2003, all known evidence had been archived. The public gradually lost interest, and the Korean Houdini became a cautionary tale told to new prison recruits. Yet rumors persisted. Dock workers swore they'd met an old man named Mr. Cho who repaired radios and never asked for payment. He spoke softly, always wore gloves, and when someone joked about the famous fugitive, he smiled and said, "He found a better cell, that's all." Detective Park retired in 2005. On his final day, he received an unmarked envelope with no return address. Inside was a single page torn from a maintenance manual, showing the cross-section of a tunnel beneath the old prison. In the corner, faint but legible, someone had written, "Freedom isn't leaving, it's hiding in plain sight." Park never showed the note to anyone. He folded it into his jacket pocket, walked out of the station, and didn't look back. There was no trial, no captured suspect, no closure. The state listed Shin Chong-won as missing, presumed dead, though no one ever found proof. For years afterward, occasional reports surfaced of a man helping repair rural infrastructure projects, welding, plumbing, wiring, then disappearing before receiving payment. Some believed these sightings were folklore. Others quietly thought the man had simply learned the one truth: no prison could contain that freedom once earned must remain unseen to survive. For those who hunted him, the emotional cost lingered long after the headlines faded. Several officers left, the force frustrated that the case had no ending. Detective Park, now gray-haired and quiet, lived near the coast in a small apartment that faced the harbor. He often stood at the balcony, watching cargo ships drift toward the horizon, their lights moving like slow constellations. Sometimes he imagined one of those ships carrying the man he'd chased across years, and maps a figure leaning against the railing, face turned toward the wind, finally at peace. Stories like Shin's endure because they expose something we don't like to admit, that control is an illusion we build around ourselves. Prisons, walls, routines, all designed to keep order. But there will always be someone who slips through the cracks, simply because he refuses to believe those walls are real. The true mystery of Shin Chong-won isn't how he escaped, but why he stayed invisible afterward. Maybe he wasn't running from punishment, maybe he was running from attention. And that, more than any cell, was the freedom he'd been chasing all along. On the morning of July 21, 2023, traffic cameras in Hanoi captured a silver sedan stopping briefly beside the Red River Bridge. Inside sat Ho Yen Ni, a 17-year-old pageant runner-up and rising television personality. She waved to someone outside the frame, adjusted her hair, and then the car drove away. 15 minutes later, fishermen downstream saw the same vehicle abandoned near the embankment doors, open engine running. By nightfall, the current carried something terrible to the shore, a suitcase sealed with duct tape. Inside was what remained of Vietnam's newest beauty queen. The driver of the car, her 40-year-old boyfriend, had vanished without a trace. Ho Yen Ni was the kind of girl people noticed before she ever spoke. At 5'7" with wide-set eyes and a smile that looked effortless, she had become a national favorite during her first televised competition. But what captured viewers wasn't only her beauty, it was her authenticity. Born in Nam Dinh to a family of modest tailors, she'd grown up stitching fabric in her mother's shop after school. Her friends said she laughed too loudly, cried too easily, and never refused a stray animal. By 16, she'd already won 2 local pageants using the prize money to pay for her parents' rent and her younger brother's piano lessons. She lived in a rented apartment near the university, where she was preparing for entrance exams in communications. Her daily routine was ordinary morning jog by the lake, iced coffee from a stall called Hoa's Beans, modeling practice in front of a cracked mirror taped to her wall. Her neighbor recalled that she always hummed the same pop song while hanging laundry. Yen Ni dreamed of hosting travel shows, one day showing audiences the real Vietnam beyond the glamour. She collected postcards from every city she visited and taped them above her desk in perfect rows. Her relationship with businessman Tran Quoc Vinh began innocently, an older sponsor promising mentorship. Within months, friends noticed bruises she explained away as filming accidents. He showered her with gifts, controlled her schedules, and appeared at every rehearsal. Producers described him as polite but possessive, always standing just out of frame. She loved the spotlight, one photographer said later, but he loved controlling the switch. By early summer, she confided to a makeup artist that she planned to end the relationship. She had booked an audition in Ho Chi Minh City and told friends she'd found someone new, someone her own age. 2 days later, she disappeared. The impossible part wasn't that she was murdered, it was how every camera, every witness, every trace of evidence seemed to dissolve the moment she was gone. In the summer of 2023, Hanoi felt invincible. Cafes overflowed with students streaming dance clips on their phones. Motorbikes weaved through intersections like choreographed chaos, and the skyline glittered with new hotels, promising rooftop views of the Red River. For young celebrities like Ho Yen Ni, the city seemed safe, even generous. Everybody wanted a selfie, not a secret. It was exactly the kind of place where nothing truly terrible was supposed to happen. Her apartment building stood in a quiet lane near Westlake, guarded by a doorman who knew every resident by name. Security cameras covered the lobby, elevator, and gate. Neighbors often left packages unattended without worry. The only gossip came from late-night karaoke echoing down the street. Yen Ni's life looked like a fairy tale, translated into routine early photo shoots, afternoon rehearsals, dinner with sponsors, goodnight texts to her parents. Her followers saw filtered perfection. Off-camera, she juggled exhaustion, a controlling boyfriend, and the pressure to appear endlessly grateful. Tran Quoc Vinh fit neatly into that illusion. At 40, he was the kind of man people trusted on sight, tailored suits, soft voice, a handshake that promised opportunity. He told everyone he was helping her navigate fame responsibly. In public, he played the attentive mentor. In private, he tracked her phone, monitored her calls, and decided which auditions she could attend. When friends hinted that his attention seemed suffocating, she laughed it off. "He's just protective," she said. "He means well." Producers noticed subtle changes. During rehearsals, she flinched whenever her phone vibrated. At events, she smiled on cue, but kept glancing toward the exit. Makeup artists found her hiding in restrooms between segments, whispering apologies to someone on the line. Yet outwardly, everything looked fine. She still posted videos of bubble tea breaks and sunsets over the lake, captions full of hearts and gratitude. The illusion held because no one wanted to see the cracks beneath the glamour. The day before her disappearance, Yen Ni filmed a charity segment promoting environmental cleanup along the Red River. Witnesses recalled that she looked lighter, almost relieved, joking that she would soon start a new chapter. After filming, she told colleagues she had a flight to Ho Chi Minh City the next morning, and a surprise announcement waiting for her followers. She never boarded that flight. On July 21st at 8:45 a.m., she was seen entering Tran Vin's sedan outside her apartment. The driver said they were heading to breakfast before her meeting. At 9:30, traffic cameras caught the car crossing Long Bien Bridge. At 10 o'clock, it stopped on the shoulder for less than a minute. No one saw what happened inside. 15 minutes later, the car appeared empty, idling beside the embankment. When officers opened the trunk hours later, they found a faint smear of makeup on the inner lid and one false eyelash clinging to the carpet. There was no blood, no fingerprints, no sign of struggle, just that delicate eyelash trembling in the breeze as though it refused to accept what had happened. By noon that day, the disappearance of Ho Yen Ni had eclipsed every headline in Vietnam. News channels interrupted programming to replay her final footage, smiling from inside the silver sedan, waving toward the bridge. Commentators speculated about kidnappers, jealous rivals, even staged publicity. But by evening the tone shifted. Divers found a suitcase near the Red River embankment. The label had been scratched off. Inside, sealed with layers of tape, was her body. The homicide division arrived under flashing lights that reflected off the water's surface like broken mirrors. Detective Pham Minh, a veteran investigator from Hanoi CID, led the team. He ordered every centimeter of the riverbank searched before sunrise. Forensics technicians noted the absence of defensive wounds, suggesting Yen Ni had been rendered unconscious before death. Toxicology later confirmed traces of chloroform in her lungs. Time of death between 9 and 10 a.m. Minutes after she was last seen alive. Tran Quoc Vin's phone was disconnected that same hour. When police raided his condominium, they found half-packed suitcases, flight itineraries to Singapore, and a single notebook listing cash withdrawals totaling over 1 billion dong. His neighbors said he'd left early that morning carrying a duffel bag. The garage still held his second car, a black SUV with a trunk lined in plastic. Under the passenger seat, investigators recovered a hair clip with 3 missing rhinestones. The pattern matched one Yen Ni had worn on camera days before. Detective Minh requested phone tower data. Between 8:40 and 9:30, Vin's device had pinged towers along the bridge route before abruptly shutting off near the industrial outskirts. CCTV from toll booths confirmed the silver sedan returning alone minutes later. That single-frame driver, absent passenger window down, became the defining image of the case, a ghost car gliding through daylight, evidence of absence made visible. At press conferences, officials pleaded for calm, while the internet exploded with fury. Hashtags demanding justice flooded every platform. Fans posted compilations of Yen Ni's pageant moments, set to mournful piano music. Brands pulled endorsements featuring her likeness. Others released statements condemning gender violence. The investigation had turned into a national reckoning. Within 48 hours, an Interpol alert went out for Tran Quoc Vin. He had boarded a domestic flight to Da Nang under an alias, checked into a seaside motel, and vanished again before police arrived. The room reeked of cologne and cigarette smoke. On the table lay a receipt for rope gloves and duct tape purchased 2 days earlier. In the trash bin, detectives found a crumpled envelope addressed to my star. Inside was a note written in his elegant handwriting: "If I can't see you shine, no one will." The forensic unit built their timeline piece by piece. The chloroform had been purchased online weeks earlier, using a company account registered to Vin's assistant. The suitcase brand traced to a boutique he frequented. The blood found under the vehicle's floor mat matched Yenni's DNA. By the 5th day, the evidence was overwhelming. But there was still no suspect in custody, only an image of a man who had once stood smiling beside her on red carpets. Detective Min stayed awake for 30 hours straight, reading through Vin's bank logs. One entry caught his eye, a transfer made the night before the murder to an offshore account linked to a private charter company. The plane had departed from Da Nang the morning after her body was found, bound for Macau. No passenger manifest listed Vin by name, but one entry used initials T.Q. and matched his height and age. The pilot later told investigators the passenger had worn sunglasses and said nothing for the entire flight. By the end of the week, Hanoi's skyline was plastered with her photographs, billboards, bus stops, television screens frozen on that same radiant smile. To the public, she remained forever 17, framed by studio light. For the detectives, she became a lesson carved into every late-night briefing. Even in a city full of cameras, the truth can slip away between frames. For weeks after the suitcase was pulled from the Red River, the world hunted a man who seemed to exist only in photographs. Tran Quoc Vin's face appeared on every television screen, from Bangkok to Singapore, his eyes frozen mid-smile. Rewards tripled with each passing week. Yet every lead dissolved like smoke. Interpol alerts lit up airports across Southeast Asia. A man matching his description was detained in Kuala Lumpur, wrong passport, wrong accent. In Manila, police surrounded a guest house only to find a Korean tourist, terrified by the shouting. A tip from Hong Kong claimed Vin had boarded a ferry to Macau disguised as a priest. Another insisted he'd shaved his head and joined a monastery in Chiang Mai. Each story drew headlines, then vanished when proven false. Detective Pham Min's task force moved through airports, embassies, and currency exchange records, chasing shadows. At one point, they traced a bank withdrawal in Phnom Penh, convinced they were days behind him. It turned out to be a stolen card. Another lead suggested he'd bribed a cargo ship captain. Divers later found nothing but empty fuel drums drifting near Ha Long Bay. Every trail ended in water or rumor. Meanwhile, the media fed on speculation. One tabloid accused Yenni's modeling agency of covering up contractual abuse. Another hinted her death had ties to a trafficking ring. Influencers posted videos claiming insider knowledge, each one contradicting the last. Public faith in the investigation fractured. Protesters gathered outside police headquarters, holding candles and photographs of the smiling teenager whose dream had turned into a national nightmare. Min kept a small board in his office, the kind detectives use to see patterns in chaos. Over time, it became a collage of circles and arrows. CCTV stills, airline receipts, pages from Yenni's diary found in her apartment. Her handwriting looped softly across pastel paper. "Someday I'll travel alone. I just want to breathe without asking permission." That line haunted him. The further he dug, the clearer the pattern became, not of a random killing, but of control sustained over months. The first significant break came not from airports or customs officers, but from a phone technician repairing network lines in Da Nang. He discovered an abandoned prepaid SIM card inserted into a public phone near the docks. The number matched one Vin had used under an alias. Call logs showed 2 numbers dialed repeatedly, both traced to a travel agent in Macau, and a woman named Leon, a 36-year-old assistant once employed by Vin's company. When Leon was questioned, she denied involvement, but investigators noticed her hands trembling as she signed the statement. Under pressure, she finally admitted that Vin had contacted her after the murder. He told her to transfer money to an account in Cambodia and destroy all records. In exchange, he promised to start over somewhere quiet. She hadn't heard from him since. She handed over a USB drive containing old company backups. She claimed they were meaningless accounting files. Inside that drive, forensic analysts found a hidden folder encrypted under the name Yen. When decrypted, it contained hundreds of photos and videos of the victim, private moments, hotel rooms, rehearsals, even footage recorded through a window from across the street. Each file was time-stamped, cataloged, entitled by emotion: happy, angry, scared. The discovery reframed the case. This wasn't spontaneous violence. It was obsession meticulously archived. The so-called beauty queen murder was not about jealousy, it was about ownership documented in real time. Detective Min stared at the flickering thumbnails on his monitor until dawn. He realized the hunt for Tran Quoc Vin had never been about distance. It was about visibility. The man wasn't hiding from law enforcement. He was hiding behind the image he'd created, a respectable businessman whose mask had become his only identity. Once the mask broke, he ceased to exist. The following morning, a call came from Macau's Immigration Bureau. Someone using a Vietnamese passport under the name Du Minh Thon had been hospitalized after a car crash outside Tape Pier. The height, age, and scar on the left wrist all matched Tran Quoc Vin. Detective Min booked the first flight out. When Detective Pham Min arrived in Macau, the air outside the hospital was thick with humidity and diesel fumes from passing ferries. Police escorted him through crowded corridors toward a private recovery room guarded by 2 officers. Inside, lying beneath a white sheet, was the man the world had been chasing for nearly a month. His face was bruised, one leg in traction, and yet the moment their eyes met, Min knew it was him. Tran Quoc Vin didn't look like a criminal or a celebrity. He looked like someone who had finally run out of places to hide. Doctors said he'd crashed a stolen taxi into a barrier during a storm while trying to reach the harbor. The impact shattered his leg but spared his life. He carried no identification except a wallet filled with foreign cash and a ring engraved with Yen Ni's initials. When Min placed it on the table, Vin stared at it in silence for nearly a minute before whispering she promised she wouldn't leave. Over the next 3 days, Min conducted the interviews himself. Vin spoke calmly, recounting details only the killer could know: how he'd drugged her coffee that morning, how he'd rehearsed every movement, how he'd driven to the bridge because the river was quiet and she liked the view. His voice never cracked. When Min asked why he'd taped her body inside a suitcase, he smiled faintly and said, so she wouldn't drift apart. But the true horror wasn't in the confession, it was in what came next. Investigators examined the phone recovered from his belongings. Among the videos were recordings taken after her death. Vin speaking softly to the camera as though addressing her spirit, describing their future together in various cities, listing flight numbers, hotel reservations, wedding plans that would never exist. In one clip dated 2 days after the murder, he sat in a dim motel room and said, "They'll remember you as perfect. I made sure of that." The footage proved what psychologists would later call narcissistic preservation, his need to control her image, even after destroying her life. The digital files weren't evidence of regret, they were trophies. When authorities prepared to extradite him to Vietnam, a twist emerged that rewrote the entire timeline. A forensic specialist in Macau noticed irregularities in his medical chart, specifically the age listed on his blood records. It read 48, not 40. DNA testing confirmed why Tran Quoc Vin wasn't who he claimed to be. His real name was Tran Quoc Hung Vin's older brother, who had assumed his identity years earlier after a business collapse and fraud conviction. The man who had courted Ho Yen Ni had been living under his brother's name, borrowing legitimacy and reputation to rebuild his life. The real Vin had died overseas 5 years earlier. Every public appearance, every magazine feature, every sponsorship had been built on a lie. The charismatic businessman had been a ghost from the start. When Min confronted him with the evidence, the prisoner simply nodded. "Names don't matter," he said. "She loved who I became. Isn't that what matters?" The statement chilled the entire room. It was no longer just a murder, it was a performance that had begun long before the crime itself. The extradition proceeded quietly to avoid public spectacle. In Hanoi, the trial lasted 9 days. The defense claimed mental instability, citing years of untreated psychosis. The prosecution countered with video evidence and written journals showing deliberate planning. The verdict came swiftly: guilty of premeditated murder, sentenced to death. He showed no reaction when the judge read the sentence, only asking to keep the ring found in his pocket. The request was denied. Outside the courthouse, a crowd gathered holding white lilies. Cameras flashed as the verdict was announced. Among them stood Yen Ni's younger brother, now 15, clutching a framed photo of her smiling in her pageant sash. He said nothing, just bowed once toward the building and walked away. Inside the press room, Detective Min faced the microphones and summed up what everyone was thinking. "We caught the man, but we'll never truly understand the story," he told himself. After the trial, the name Tran Quoc Hung disappeared from newspapers almost overnight. The court banned further publication of his image to protect the victim's family. Officially, he was transferred to a high-security facility outside Hanoi to await execution. Unofficially, guards said he spent his days writing letters to no one, long, rambling confessions addressed to my star. Each ended the same way: "You're still mine when the lights go out." He never appealed his sentence. The execution order came quietly 2 years later. No family claimed the body. The aftermath left ripples that no verdict could contain. Ho Yen Ni's parents shut down their tailoring shop and moved to the countryside, where they lived near a pagoda that hosts annual prayers for victims of violence. Her younger brother gave up piano lessons and enlisted in the Navy, saying he wanted to protect people who can't run. Her apartment, once filled with bright clothes and makeup, was emptied and repainted. The landlord kept the mirror taped to the wall where she had practiced her pageant smile. No one else ever lived there long. The entertainment industry tried to move on. New contests crowned new winners, each more polished than the last. But among young women entering pageants, her name became a quiet warning. Don't mistake attention for affection. Don't let charm disguise control. One former contestant said she still checks the rearview mirror whenever a car stops on a bridge. Detective Pham Min retired the following year. He kept the file sealed inside a metal drawer labeled simply Case 0715. Sometimes, during the humid evenings, when the city lights reflected on the river, he would walk the same bridge where the story began. The traffic still hummed, the water still moved beneath, carrying the same restless sound that once drowned out a scream. He never crossed that bridge without looking toward the far bank, as if expecting to see the silver sedan parked there again. The world remembers Ho Yen Ni as a symbol of beauty and tragedy, but beneath the headlines was a truth more ordinary and more frightening. She had done everything right. She told friends she wanted out, tried to end things peacefully, and trusted the system to protect her. Yet the system saw glamour, not danger. The danger was smiling in photographs beside her the entire time. Stories like hers remind us that evil doesn't always hide in the dark. Sometimes it stands under bright lights, wearing designer clothes applauded by the crowd. We imagine monsters as strangers in alleys, but often they are people who say they love you and mean it only as ownership. Ho Yen Ni's story is no longer about fame or envy, it's about the thin line between devotion and control, and how sometimes the most dazzling spotlight only hides the shadow standing right behind it. On the afternoon of August 10, 1983, in a quiet Ohio suburb, 51-year-old Helen Becerra finished watering her garden, waved to a neighbor across the street, and went inside her two-story home to make lunch. That was the last time anyone ever saw her alive. By evening, her husband returned to find the front door locked from the inside, the radio playing softly in the kitchen, and a half-cut tomato still on the counter. Helen's purse and car keys were on the table. Her shoes were by the door. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon and bleach. For 5 years, nobody could explain how a woman could vanish from her own locked home without a single trace. Helen Becerra was the embodiment of Midwestern steadiness. She'd worked part-time at a local library, ran the church bake sale every summer, and had a laugh that friends described as the kind that made you feel like everything would be fine. She and her husband George had raised 2 children, Mark and Laura, both now adults living nearby. She baked on Sundays, wrote letters to her sister in Michigan every week, and never forgot birthdays. She loved crosswords, sunflowers, and old Motown records, and when she danced, she still closed her eyes like a teenager at prom. Her neighbors adored her. Every Christmas she organized the street potluck, decorating her porch with strings of white lights she refused to replace even when half burned out. She was the kind of person who loaned measuring cups, remembered your dog's name, and never complained when life felt ordinary. But behind the calm routines was a family growing quietly fractured. Her stepson, 17-year-old Eric Becerra, had recently moved back in after being expelled from high school for vandalism. He was the son of George's first marriage, and Helen had spent years trying to bridge the distance between them. She bought him notebooks when he said he wanted to draw, baked his favorite chocolate chip cookies when he returned home, and told friends she was determined to help him find direction. Eric rarely answered her kindness. He spent his days in the basement, playing loud music, and his nights sneaking out with friends who smelled of gasoline and cigarettes. That summer, the tension in the house thickened. Neighbors overheard arguments, muffled voices, slammed doors. Helen's voice sharp but not angry, always pleading for calm. George worked late shifts as a mechanic and often came home after midnight. Helen's daughter Laura would later tell police she'd stopped visiting because the house felt heavy, like everyone was pretending not to hear something breaking. And yet on that August day, nothing seemed unusual. The mail was still in the box. The garden hose lay neatly coiled. The calendar on the fridge had a note in Helen's handwriting, "Buy peaches for cobbler." Everything suggested she'd planned for tomorrow. Everything except the silence that followed. When officers arrived, they found no sign of forced entry, no broken windows, no footprints. The only odd detail was a faint discoloration on the basement steps, a streak the color of rust that disappeared after 2 days. Forensics found nothing useful, no fingerprints, no blood. Helen Becerra had simply vanished between noon and 1 p.m. from a locked house in a neighborhood where nothing bad was supposed to happen. In the early 80s, Maple Hollow was the kind of Ohio neighborhood people moved to when they wanted life to slow down. Streets curved through rows of maple trees. Mailboxes leaned toward one another, like friendly gossipers, and children rode bikes until the streetlights blinked on. The last major crime had been a stolen lawnmower in 1979. Everyone knew everyone. Doors stayed unlocked until bedtime, and the most alarming sound most nights was a raccoon knocking over trash cans. Safety wasn't an expectation. It was an assumption baked into daily life. The Becerra's home sat at the end of a cul-de-sac bordered by trimmed hedges and a white fence George had built himself. Helen tended the front garden, meticulously planting marigolds and basil in precise lines. Neighbors often saw her kneeling in the dirt, gloved hands dusted with soil, humming softly to herself. On warm evenings, she would bring lemonade to anyone passing by. Even when Eric moved back home, bringing tension with him, Helen kept the same gentle routines, as if consistency could protect the house from whatever unease had settled inside it. That August day began like any other. The mail carrier waved at her around 11, and she waved back, saying she'd finally finished painting the kitchen. The temperature climbed into the mid-80s, cicadas droning through the trees. At 12:15, Mrs. Cowan from across the street noticed Helen pulling weeds near the porch. At 12:45, a delivery truck rolled past and the driver saw the front door standing open. By 1:15, it was closed again. The timeline ended there. When George returned home, around 5:30, he assumed Helen was napping. He called her name from the hall, noticed the smell of cinnamon, and smiled. It was the scent of her cobbler, the one she made whenever she wanted to celebrate small things. But the oven was cold, and the dish sat empty on the counter. The knife beside it had been cleaned and dried. Upstairs, the bed was neatly made. In the bathroom, her hairbrush still held a few strands of gray blonde hair. It was as if she had stepped out for a moment and forgotten to come back. Police initially treated the case as a voluntary disappearance. Maybe she'd gone to visit family, they said, or needed space. But her purse, wallet, and car keys told a different story. She hadn't planned to leave. Her half-finished grocery list still sat on the table: peaches, sugar, milk, candles. As officers canvassed the neighborhood, one neighbor mentioned hearing a single thud around lunchtime, like furniture being moved, but thought nothing of it. Another said she saw Eric's car parked in the driveway earlier than usual, though the boy claimed he'd been at a friend's house across town. The timeline didn't quite fit. There were no tire tracks, no signs of struggle, no broken glass. Just the ordinary hum of a neighborhood so sure of its own peace that nobody noticed the moment it shattered. By the following morning, Helen's disappearance was front-page news. Reporters described it as the vanishing homemaker mystery. People locked their doors for the first time in years. Children were told not to wander past the stop sign, and inside the Becerra house, the smell of bleach clung stubbornly to the floorboards, a detail officers would later revisit with unsettling clarity. Detectives arrived the next morning with dogs, flashlights, and a warrant to search the property. Reporters watched from behind the police tape as uniformed officers combed the yard inch by inch. The air buzzed with speculation. Some whispered about kidnappers, others about secret affairs. But the evidence pointed inward. The house felt staged, too neat, as if someone had taken time to clean without understanding what real cleaning looked like. In the basement, investigators found faint streaks on the concrete steps that fluoresced under black light. Forensics confirmed they were traces of blood, too diluted for full analysis, but enough to suggest violence. A single mop stood against the wall, its head recently rinsed and smelling of bleach. The drain pipe beneath the utility sink had been unscrewed and reattached. Inside it, technicians found strands of hair that matched Helen's. The crime scene was quiet, clinical, and deeply personal. Detective Alan Ross led the investigation. He'd handled missing persons cases for over 20 years, but something about this one unsettled him. "It's like she disappeared in the middle of a chore," he told a reporter. "Whoever did it knew her habits enough to erase her without breaking the pattern." The family gave statements. George appeared exhausted, his hands trembling as he described finding the house locked. His daughter Laura wept through her interview. Eric, however, remained oddly detached. When asked where he'd been that afternoon, he said he'd been cruising around with a friend named Jeff Collins. Police verified Jeff's existence, but not the alibi. Jeff claimed Eric showed up at his place around 2, not noon. That left an unaccounted window of nearly 2 hours, the exact time Helen vanished. Detectives searched Eric's room. Inside a dresser drawer, they found a pocket knife with a dried stain on its hinge. The lab later confirmed it was human blood, though too degraded for typing. In the trash bin lay a torn magazine photo of a woman whose face had been scribbled out with pen. When asked, Eric shrugged and said, "It was just a joke." Officers also noted that his basement mattress had been removed and replaced with a new one purchased the previous day. George said he hadn't noticed. He worked long hours and rarely went downstairs. For days, the case unfolded with grim efficiency. Police questioned, neighbors searched nearby woods, even drained a small pond at the end of the street. Nothing surfaced. The dogs lost the scent at the edge of the property, circling back toward the garage each time. There, in a corner behind boxes of tools, they found a piece of cloth, partially burned, the remnant of a floral apron Helen often wore. The fabric's singed edge matched the pattern from one of her photographs. By late August, suspicion fell squarely on Eric. He had no criminal record beyond vandalism, yet his behavior bordered on defiance. He attended school as if nothing had happened, bragging to friends that the police didn't have anything. When officers brought him in for a polygraph, he smirked and asked if he could keep the results for college applications. The test registered deception on every major question. Detective Ross confronted him again, a week later, laying out the evidence: the mop, the drain pipe, the apron, the missing mattress. Eric said nothing for nearly a full minute, then laughed softly. "You think I could do something like that?" he asked. "You really think I'm that smart?" The question wasn't denial, it was challenge. Ross left the interrogation room, knowing they were facing someone who didn't feel guilt, only curiosity about how far he could go before being caught. With no body, prosecutors couldn't file charges. The case went cold. Months turned into years. The house was sold. The Becerra family fractured under grief. George died in 1987, still insisting his son was innocent. And then in the spring of 1988, a new homeowner renovating the basement struck something hard beneath the concrete floor. It wasn't stone. The jackhammer struck concrete for less than a minute before the workers hit something softer. The smell reached them first: earth mildew and something sour that no one wanted to name. Beneath a layer of cement, barely 2 inches thick, wrapped in what used to be a floral bedsheet, lay the skeletal remains of a woman curled tightly against herself as if bracing for impact. The police arrived within the hour. By nightfall, the Becerra house was surrounded by floodlights and camera crews. After 5 years of uncertainty, Helen had come home. The coroner confirmed the identification through dental records. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the skull. Time of death matched the day she disappeared. Whoever buried her had poured a thin coat of fresh concrete to conceal the grave, a task requiring both strength and precision. Investigators reconstructed the scene and concluded that only someone familiar with the basement layout could have done it quickly and quietly. There were no fingerprints, but the hardware store where George bought supplies kept receipts on file, one dated the week after her disappearance. showed a purchase for cement mix and a new shovel paid in cash. The signature was not George's handwriting. Detective Ross reopened the case. Years had passed, witnesses had moved and memories had blurred. George was dead, Laura had relocated, and Eric, now 22, was living 3 counties away with his girlfriend. When confronted, he appeared unfazed. "You found her," he said, lighting a cigarette. "Guess that explains the smell." He agreed to accompany detectives to the station, but refused to answer questions without an attorney. The lawyer arrived an hour later, demanding proof beyond speculation. Ross laid the evidence across the table: the receipt, the blood traces, the burned apron, and a photo of the basement excavation. Eric stared at it expressionless, then said, "You ever bury something so deep you start to forget it's even there?" Before the confession came, investigators endured a week of chaos. The media blamed George, claiming the husband had killed his wife and died before justice could be served. A second theory suggested an affair with a neighbor, while others whispered about cult involvement after reporters learned Helen had attended a new Bible study group before her disappearance. Every rumor filled newspaper columns. None of it mattered once the tapes started rolling. On March 15, 1988, Eric Becerra signed a confession. He said the argument started over chores. Helen had asked him to clean the basement before George returned from work. He refused. She threatened to tell his father about missing money from his wallet. "She grabbed my arm," he said flatly. "I just hit her once. It wasn't even that hard. She fell and hit her head on the step." He claimed panic afterward. He tried to wake her, failed, and dragged the body to the utility area. For hours, he sat beside her, smoking cigarettes, waiting for the noise in his head to stop. That night, he cleaned everything with bleach and started mixing cement using leftover bags from the garage. He buried her, replaced the mop, scrubbed the floor, and went to bed. The next morning, he ate breakfast at the same table, listening to the radio like nothing had happened. During questioning, Ross asked why he never confessed earlier. Eric shrugged. "Nobody asked the right question," he said. "They were all too busy looking for strangers." The court later determined his confession voluntary and admissible. When the verdict came guilty of second-degree murder, he showed no reaction. Sentenced to life imprisonment with possibility of parole after 25 years, Eric reportedly told the judge, "I didn't mean to kill her. I just wanted her to stop talking." Those words echoed through Ohio for months. Detective Ross attended the sentencing but left before reporters arrived. In his report, he wrote one final observation: this was not a crime of rage. It was a crime of indifference, a silence that swallowed a woman whole and then pretended she'd gone missing, not died instantly. The autopsy revealed faint bone remodeling along the edge of her skull, fracture, microscopic signs of healing that could only occur if she'd been alive for several hours after the initial blow. It meant that while Eric was mixing cement while he was sealing the floor, she had still been breathing slowly, faintly buried under the sound of his own panic. That single discovery changed the narrative from impulsive killing to something far darker, of conscious neglect, the deliberate choice to let her die. Detective Ross read the report twice before setting it down. He didn't kill her because he lost control, he told the prosecutor. He killed her because he regained it. When the news broke, the town that had once pitied Eric's family turned on them completely. Laura, Helen's daughter, refused interviews, but one neighbor recalled seeing her standing in the driveway weeks later, staring at the basement window. She said she could still hear her mother humming down there, the neighbor told reporters. Like the sound got stuck in the concrete. The court reopened sentencing to consider first-degree charges, but Eric's attorneys appealed. The confession, they argued, had been coerced. The new evidence, they claimed, could not prove awareness. The appeal failed. During the second hearing, Eric appeared in shackles, his expression the same unreadable calm. When asked whether he had heard movement beneath the floor that night, he looked at the judge and said, "I thought it was the pipes." The courtroom fell silent. The judge, visibly shaken, called it the most chilling answer I've ever heard. Helen was reburied in a small cemetery 2 towns over. Only a handful of people attended: her daughter, her sister, and Detective Ross. George's ashes were placed beside her, fulfilling a promise she had written in her will years before. The inscription on her gravestone read simply, "She was kindness, nothing more, nothing less." After sentencing, Eric spent his early years in prison as an exemplary inmate, reading, volunteering, earning a GED. Counselors described him as polite, articulate, remorseful in theory. Yet during a psychological evaluation in 1993, he made a remark that chilled his therapist. "When you cover something up long enough," he said, "it stops feeling like a secret and starts feeling like home." The quote leaked, appearing in an article about infamous Midwestern murders. For a while, it turned Eric Becerra into a minor celebrity among true crime enthusiasts, a boy who buried his stepmother and acted like she'd gone missing. But for those who had known Helen, the story wasn't about infamy. It was about the ordinary, invisible ways cruelty can grow in silence until it feels like normal life. Years later, when asked if he regretted anything, Eric told a reporter, "I regret not leaving the house sooner. She would have found another reason to disappear." Even behind bars, he clung to the illusion that he'd simply been a bystander to his own crime. That investigators agreed was the final twist, not the act itself, but his belief that doing nothing had made him innocent. As of 2025, Eric Becerra is 60 years old and still incarcerated at Marion Correctional Institution. He has been denied parole 3 times. His file describes him as cooperative, intelligent, and emotionally detached. He tutors inmates in English literature and writes essays for a prison newsletter under a pseudonym. Guards say he keeps his cell spotless, folding his clothes with the same neatness Helen once taught him. When asked about the case during an interview in 2019, he said, "I think about her less now. That's probably what she would have wanted." The interviewer noted that he smiled when he said it. Laura Becerra never returned to Maple Hollow. She married, moved west, and started a family of her own. For years, she refused to talk about her stepbrother. Only once during a documentary interview did she break her silence. "People say evil looks like rage," she said. "But in our house it looked like silence, the kind that sits at the table with you, passes the salt, and never says a word." Detective Ross retired shortly after the retrial. He kept Helen's case file in his home office, its edges worn soft from rereading. In his notes he wrote, "There are 2 kinds of killers, the ones who lash out and the ones who tidy up afterward." He believed Eric belonged to the latter, the kind who confuse control with redemption. The house at Maple Hollow was demolished in the early 90s. The new owners planted a community garden on the lot, unaware that beneath the fresh soil, concrete fragments from the old foundation still lay buried. Each spring, marigolds grow there without being planted, as though something stubborn beneath the ground refuses to die completely. Helen's sister visits the cemetery once a year, leaving a bouquet of sunflowers and a folded recipe card on the grave. She says she does it not to remember the murder, but to remind herself that kindness can still survive brutality. "Helen made people feel safe," she told a reporter. "That's what makes it hurt the most." She believed goodness could protect her. The legacy of the case extends far beyond one family. Law enforcement training programs across Ohio now use the Becerra file to teach investigators about domestic violence, misdirection, how familiarity can blind people to danger hiding in plain sight. The story is studied not for its mystery, but for its warning that sometimes evil isn't the stranger at the door, but the person who already has a key. What happened to Helen Becerra is less about murder than about silence, the silence that lets cruelty grow behind the polite routines of ordinary life. Her story reminds us that evil doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, cleans up after itself, and smiles for the neighbors. On the night of April 25, 2011, firefighters responding to a blaze in Nottingham arrived to find a two-story home engulfed in flames. Inside, they discovered the body of a 47-year-old woman so badly burned she could only be identified through dental records. Her son, 14-year-old Daniel Bartlam, stood outside, wrapped in a blanket, claiming intruders had broken in and set the house on fire. Hours later, detectives found a claw hammer hidden beneath his bed, its handle blackened with soot and something darker. The woman inside wasn't a stranger. She was his mother. Daniel Bartlam was the kind of teenager most teachers described as quiet, maybe a little odd but polite. He loved video games, fantasy novels, and long hours alone in his room. His classmates teased him for his soft voice and fascination with horror films, particularly those about revenge. He idolized movie villains who seemed misunderstood, who justified cruelty as self-defense. His favorite was a soap opera character who'd once killed his own mother on television. Daniel could quote the entire scene from memory. At home, he lived with his mother Jacqueline, a single parent who worked as a teacher's aide. She'd divorced years earlier, but stayed amicable with Daniel's father, who visited on weekends. Friends said Jacqueline adored her son, though she often seemed tired. She once told a colleague she worried he was drifting somewhere she couldn't reach. He spent hours writing stories in spiral notebooks, fantasies filled with heroes wronged by the world, fighting back with hammers and fire. Teachers encouraged his creativity, unaware how literal those fantasies would become. Their house sat at the edge of Sherwood Rise, a quiet neighborhood framed by trees and brick fences. Neighbors recalled seeing them walk their dog together in the evenings, laughing like any mother and son. Yet inside the home tension brewed. Daniel resented her rules, bedtime limits, confiscated video games, no laptop after midnight. Jacqueline, sensing his isolation, enrolled him in counseling, but he stopped attending after 2 sessions. He began telling friends she was ruining his life. In the weeks before the fire, something in him shifted. He grew secretive, locking his door even when he was alone. He recorded short videos on his phone, speaking to the camera in a calm, deliberate tone. "They'll understand one day," he said in one clip, "that heroes don't wait for permission." The recordings were never sent to anyone. They were rehearsals. On that April evening, Jacqueline texted her sister around 9 p.m., saying Daniel was moody but fine. An hour later, flames consumed the house. When investigators sifted through the wreckage, they found the hammer first, then the notebooks, each page describing almost exactly what had happened that night, written days before it occurred. From the outside, the Bartlam house looked perfectly ordinary. The front garden was small but tidy, a narrow strip of grass bordered by daffodils that Jacqueline planted each spring. A faded welcome mat sat by the door, and the curtains were always drawn halfway, allowing a soft glow from the living room to spill onto the sidewalk. Inside, everything was measured and predictable: dinner at 6, television until 9, Daniel in bed by 10. It was the kind of structure she believed would keep them safe, routine as protection, order as love. Neighbors described them as quiet, even sweet. Jacqueline often baked cookies for the elderly woman next door. Daniel helped carry groceries for residents along the block. To anyone watching, they were a model of small domestic peace. But friends noticed subtle cracks. Jacqueline had begun confiding that Daniel's temper was getting worse. "He's polite to strangers," she told one coworker, "but with me, he's someone else, cold." She brushed off her own unease, insisting he was just a teenager, figuring himself out. Inside Daniel's room, the signs were far more ominous. He decorated the walls with movie posters, villains standing triumphant, flames rising behind them. On his desk, a small notebook sat open to a page titled "Justice Scene." The handwriting alternated between neat paragraphs and scribbled lines that spiraled into dark loops. Beneath it, written in all caps, "Remember to make it look like the show." Investigators would later discover he'd spent weeks scripting his mother's death, drawing diagrams of the house, timing how long flames would take to spread through the wooden beams. On April 25th, the day of the fire, Jacqueline woke early to prepare lessons for work. She left Daniel breakfast and a note reminding him to feed the dog. He texted back one word, "Okay." That afternoon, they argued about his grades. A neighbor overheard raised voices but dismissed it. Teenagers argued all the time. At dinner, things appeared normal again. They ate spaghetti and watched television together, one of the crime dramas Daniel loved. Around 9:30, Jacqueline said goodnight and went upstairs to shower. Daniel waited until the house grew quiet. He retrieved the claw hammer from his desk drawer where it had sat for days wrapped in a t-shirt. The handle still bore his fingerprints from practice swings in the garage. In his pocket, he carried a USB drive containing his story, a short script he'd written about a boy who killed his mother to save her from corruption. It wasn't rage, it was rehearsal. At 10:15, neighbors heard what they later described as a sharp noise like metal striking wood. Moments later, smoke began seeping from the upper windows. Firefighters arrived within minutes to find Daniel standing outside, barefoot, eyes dry, claiming intruders had attacked them. He said he'd escaped through the window after hearing his mother scream. He repeated the story twice, then asked an officer whether the dog had made it out. When told it hadn't, he shrugged and said, "That's too bad." As investigators combed the ruins, one fire inspector noticed something strange. The accelerant patterns on the floor didn't match a random blaze. They followed a deliberate trail leading from the living room to the stairwell. Near the base of the steps lay melted fragments of plastic and metal, later confirmed to be from a hammer handle. Daniel's fingerprints were the only ones on it. The illusion of safety had finally burned away, exposing what had really been simmering behind closed doors. Not anger, but a child's desire to script his own legend, and a mother who never realized the story she was living in wasn't hers anymore. By the time daylight touched the charred frame of the Bartlam house, Daniel's story had already begun to fall apart. At first, he told detectives that masked intruders had broken in, attacked his mother, and set the fire while he hid in his room. But firefighters had found no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no footprints, no pry marks. The door had been bolted from the inside. When investigators pressed him, Daniel adjusted the details. Maybe the attackers had come through the back window, maybe they'd fled before he saw them. Each explanation dissolved under the simplest questions. Detective Inspector Rob Griffin, who'd handled domestic homicide cases before, noticed something strange in Daniel's demeanor. He wasn't frightened or confused. He was curious, watching every question as though studying a scene. He kept asking how we knew what we knew, Griffin later said. It was like he was critiquing our investigation, not defending himself. Forensic teams sifted through the remains of the house, identifying burn patterns that pointed toward deliberate ignition. Near the living room, they found traces of petrol residue on a carpet square that had been peeled up and replaced weeks before. The accelerant had been poured in a deliberate line leading to the stairway. In Daniel's desk drawer, miraculously unburned, thanks to its metal casing, they found several USB drives. On one was a document titled Project Daniel. It was a screenplay. The story followed a boy named Peter who kills his mother with a hammer after she forbids him from pursuing his destiny. In the final scene, Peter burns the house down to hide the evidence, then emerges into the night as a misunderstood hero. The last line read, "The fire purifies everything." Investigators also discovered a collection of YouTube search logs and bookmarked clips of horror films, including one from the soap opera Coronation Street, a storyline where a character murdered his abusive mother with a hammer. Daniel had watched it dozens of times in the weeks leading up to the murder. The combination of the script, the videos, and the accelerant trail made his intent undeniable. When police informed him of these findings, Daniel didn't deny them. He simply said it was supposed to end differently. During formal questioning, he spoke softly, almost detached. "She was always correcting me," he said, "always saying I should be normal. I just wanted her to understand I wasn't her project." When asked why he'd set the fire, he explained, "It was the only way to make it look cinematic." His words turned the interrogation room cold. Psychologists were brought in to evaluate him. They found no evidence of psychosis or hallucinations, only narcissism, a fascination with narrative control, and what one expert called a blurred line between imagination and accountability. He didn't believe he was evil. He believed he was the protagonist of his own misunderstood story. Forensic analysis tied everything together. The hammer's blood pattern matched Jacqueline's injuries. The fire had been ignited with petrol siphoned from a garden can. DNA evidence on the tool and Daniel's fingerprints on the lighter sealed the case. Within 2 days he was charged with murder and arson. Because he was a minor, his name was initially withheld, but the story spread fast, a teenager who'd killed his mother because of a television plot. In custody, Daniel asked for a notebook. When a guard brought him one, he began to write again, this time about a boy who goes to prison for a crime he didn't commit. The first sentence read, "People never understand art when it's still wet." When Daniel's trial began in Nottingham Crown Court, the press called it the Hammer Boy case. Tabloids printed his photo beside movie villains, comparing him to fictional killers he once idolized. The public wanted a monster, but what they got was a pale teenager in an oversized suit, sitting quietly beside his solicitor, head bowed as if playing the part of remorse. Every gesture seemed deliberate, as though he'd studied how guilt was supposed to look. The defense immediately floated the idea of diminished responsibility. Psychiatrists testified that Daniel suffered from fantasy-prone personality disorder, a rare condition blurring imagination and reality. They argued he hadn't known fiction from truth, that he'd simply acted out a scene from his stories. His lawyer described him as a child lost in delusion, driven by television imagery and neglect. To the courtroom, it sounded convenient, an attempt to turn obsession into illness. Prosecutor Paul Mann dismantled the claim, line by line. He showed the jury Daniel's notebooks, the timelines, the accelerant purchase receipts, and the digital files titled Final Draft. "These aren't hallucinations," he said. "They're rehearsals." The jury watched clips from the soap opera Daniel had mimicked the hammer swing the fire, and then saw the matching images from the crime scene. Even the camera angle captured from a neighbor's CCTV mirrored the fictional frame. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. For days, the courtroom oscillated between horror and disbelief. Reporters scribbled quotes like stage directions, boy smiles at photo of mother defendant, doodles hammer on notepad. At one point, Daniel leaned toward his attorney and whispered something that made the man's face go white. Later, when asked what he'd said, the lawyer replied only, he was wondering if this would make a good movie. Psychologists hired by the prosecution agreed Daniel was not insane. He was calculating, they said, and entirely aware of his actions. One expert described him as possessing a filmmaker's detachment from suffering. He didn't lack empathy, he lacked reality outside his own script. The red herrings extended beyond the courtroom. Online forums erupted with theories. Maybe Daniel had been abused, maybe the mother provoked him, maybe violent media was to blame. The debate became less about guilt and more about who society could blame for raising a killer in the digital age. Teachers defended him as creative but lonely. Classmates said he'd been bullied, though none could name who did it. The lines blurred again, villain, victim, or reflection of something larger. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury retired for deliberation. They returned in just 6 hours. The verdict: guilty of murder. Daniel showed no emotion as it was read. When asked if he had anything to say, he shook his head. His lawyer later revealed that he'd whispered, "At least people are watching." He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 16 years before parole eligibility, unusually harsh for his age. But the judge called it a crime of theatrical cruelty. She told him, "You wrote your mother's death before you committed it, and you performed it with chilling precision." The public fixation lingered for months, but eventually faded beneath newer headlines. The house on Sherwood Rise was rebuilt. The dog's remains were buried beside Jacqueline's grave, marked with a small stone carved simply with one word: loved. But what nobody knew until years after the trial, when journalists obtained his confiscated prison writings, was that Daniel Bartlam had never stopped writing his story. He had only changed its setting. The notebooks recovered from his cell contained hundreds of pages describing an alternate ending to his crime. In this version, the boy was released early, praised by psychologists, and hired by a film studio to write horror scripts based on truth. The story ended with him attending a red carpet premiere about his own life, shaking hands with the actors portraying his family. The final line read, "I told you it was just fiction." The discovery shocked even veteran investigators. He hadn't written about remorse or redemption. He'd written a sequel. Each notebook was dated meticulously, outlining character arcs, storyboards, and imagined dialogue for future interviews. The pages blurred between fantasy and foresight, as if he believed notoriety itself could rewrite the past. In interviews, psychologists noted that Daniel's obsession with narrative control had deepened in prison. One evaluation from 2016 described him as calm, articulate, and incapable of perceiving human tragedy without narrative framing. He told the therapist, "I didn't kill her, I edited her out." The line would later appear word for word in one of his drafts. Outside the prison walls, Jacqueline's family tried to reclaim her memory. Her sister campaigned for tighter media regulation of violent programming, while friends from her school planted a small memorial garden behind the campus. They grew daffodils, the same kind Jacqueline once planted along the fence Daniel burned. Students passed by it every spring, often unaware of the story behind the flowers. Despite being forbidden from publishing, fragments of Daniel's writing leaked online. True crime forums debated whether his notebooks represented artistic therapy or continued manipulation. One chilling passage stood out among readers: "Stories never die. They just need someone to keep telling them." To many, it sounded less like reflection and more like a threat. By his 18th birthday, Daniel had become a myth within the prison system. A boy who spoke like a screenwriter and treated every conversation as dialogue for a scene. Guards reported that he sometimes whispered lines to himself at night, rehearsing interviews that would never happen. "He didn't seem insane," one officer said. "He seemed busy." For the families who lost Jacqueline, the realization was unbearable. Daniel's punishment hadn't ended the story. It had given him new material. His name faded from headlines, but his myth lingered, a reminder that for some people, reality is only a stage, and empathy is just a role they choose not to play. Daniel Bartlam remains behind bars today, serving a life sentence with no sign of remorse. Psychiatrists describe him as stable but unrepentant. He still writes daily, crafting stories about redemption that never reach the page's edge. In one interview, when asked if he ever dreams of his mother, he replied, "Only when the story needs her." His words, like so many from those who came before him, reveal a truth that runs through every case in this series. Sometimes, the most horrifying monsters are not born. They're written, rehearsed, and performed until they believe their own. Script. For the families left behind, justice brought no peace, only quiet. Helen Becerra's daughter still leaves flowers on her mother's grave each August. The Yao sisters' apartment in Taichung was demolished years ago. Yet passers-by say the air feels heavier there, as if memory itself refuses to fade. In Seoul, the legend of Shin Chong-won still circulates in whispers, stories of a man who escaped not just prison, but identity itself. And somewhere in Vietnam, the Red River continues to flow past the bridge, where Ho Yen Ni's story ended, carrying the reflection of city lights that never stop flickering. Each story began with the illusion of safety homes, fame, love, control, and ended in the same place: silence. The kind of silence that settles after screaming, stops after the crowd moves on, after reporters pack their cameras. It's the sound that follows the unthinkable, the moment the world keeps turning because it must. That's what makes these stories linger. Not the blood, not the evidence, not even the cruelty. It's the ordinariness, the soft domestic rhythms shattered by one decision, one lie, 1 second, where empathy lost its footing. These are not tales of ghosts or monsters in the dark. They're stories of people who looked normal until they didn't. People who loved and then destroyed what they loved most. People who remind us that evil isn't a shadow at the edge of the light. It's the reflection staring back from the mirror when we look too long. Thank you for staying with me through every moment of this journey, for listening all the way to the end. If you haven't already, please subscribe, drop a comment letting me know what story struck you the most, and take care of each other out there. Because stories like these aren't just about fear, they're about what happens when compassion disappears and the silence that follows. And now, as the world outside grows quiet again, the rain is still falling steady and cold, tapping softly against the window. It's the same rain that opened our night together, the same rhythm that carried us through every tragedy. Somewhere out there, another story is waiting in the darkness, its first drop already forming on the glass. Leave a light on tonight,